Hey all, today I'm going to be telling you whether you should buy a house or a buy-to-let property. I'm going to be explaining the advantages and disadvantages of each and which has the better mortgage benefits, tax benefits, which makes the most money and much, much more. Now just a quick caveat, you're much more likely to get approved for a buy-to-let mortgage if you already own your own home. There are some lenders that will lend to you if you don't own your own home, but obviously you'll get much better rates if you do. So let's just assume that you already own your own home and you're debating about buying a second home and turning the old home into a rental property, or buying a completely separate buy-to-let property. But before we get started, be sure to drop a like down below and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because I make tons of other content just like this. Now let's get into the video. First off, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of a completely separate buy-to-let or a completely separate investment property. The first benefit of an entirely separate buy-to-let property is that it's much better for keeping home and investment separate. You could obviously create entirely new things like a new bank account, a new mortgage, separate bills, and just keep it all as two different things. You could even set up a completely separate limited company and run your buy-to-let through that. And I'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of buying through a limited company in a different video. This makes it way easier to organise, and you can much more easily manage your time and keep investing and home life separate. You can set yourself some time aside and say, okay, today I'm going to go to my investment property and do some work there, and then tomorrow I'm going to stay at home and spend time with the family. This leads me on to the next benefit, which is that buying a completely separate buy-to-let property means that you can keep the home that you're currently living in. Maybe you've bought your dream home and you don't really want to move. Or maybe you've got a wife and kids and you don't really want to have to move them to a different property every few years. This obviously makes it much easier for everyone else around you. It also makes the paperwork side of things much easier as well. You don't have to faff around changing your address details on your credit cards, your car insurance, your work records, your memberships, the list goes on. When buying a completely separate buy-to-let, you can also be much more specific in the type of property you want to purchase. Maybe you already have a wife and 2 kids, but you want to invest in 1-bed flats. Now obviously, that's not really going to work if you have to move into the property and live in it instead of buying a completely separate buy-to-let. And finally, the last benefit is that you don't have to live in a wreck of a property. The best way to invest in property, and the way that I teach most commonly on my channel, is to buy a property in need of refurbishment, because you can definitely add more value to the property than what you spend on it, and therefore generate a bigger profit by doing a refurbishment. But you might not want to live in a tip while you refurbish everything around you. You might not like living in a property with no paint on the walls, or no tiles on the wall in the bathroom, or no carpets on the floors. It also might not be very practical to live in a property with no carpets on the floors if you've got small kids running around, because obviously they could very easily step on some nails. Now the main disadvantage of buying a completely separate buy-to-let property is that it's going to be very expensive up front. If you're buying a second property to move into while you turn the old one into a rental property, you only need enough money for the deposit, because you can kind of refurbish the second property that you've just bought over the next few years. But obviously if you're buying a completely separate buy-to-let, you're going to need enough money for the deposit and for the refurbishment, because you're going to want to refurbish as quick as possible so that the property isn't vacant for too long. You can't really afford to buy the property and let it sit there for 6 months to a year while you save up a little bit more money for the refurbishments and do them at a leisurely pace. You obviously need to get in there and refurbish it as quick as possible, because you're not getting any money in. So therefore, you need it rented out ASAP. However, you could combat this by putting most of the refurbishments onto a 0% interest credit card. And if that sounds like something that interests you, then be sure to check out my other video here. If you're enjoying the video so far, then let me know in the comments below whether you prefer to buy a completely separate buy-to-let property or to buy a second property to move into and turn your old property into a rental property. Buying a completely separate buy-to-let property also isn't as efficient for tax purposes. If you're buying a second property and turning your old property into a rental property, when you come to sell that rental property, you don't pay capital gains tax on any of the profits that you made while you were living in that first property. Say if you lived in the first home for 5 years, and then you went out and bought the second property and turned the old property into a rental property, and then you rented out that rental property for another 5 years. When you then come to sell it after the full 10 years is up, you only pay capital gains tax on the gains that you made in the second 5 years. Also, in terms of stamp duty, if you buy a second property and you plan on selling your rental property within 3 years, you don't have to pay the 3% stamp duty surcharge from buying a second house. But obviously, if you do plan on keeping this rental property for more than 3 years, you will have to pay the stamp duty surcharge on that second property. But obviously, buying a completely separate buy-to-let property, you obviously have to pay that stamp duty surcharge anyway, and you have to pay capital gains tax on the entire period of ownership. Now, the final downside is that it might be difficult to get the completely separate property revalued in a hurry. Say if your plan is to buy the property, refurbish it, refinance and take out your initial deposit as quickly as you can, it might be difficult to get a revaluation really quickly after you've bought the property and refurbished it in a matter of a few weeks. However, say if you bought your first property as your home, lived in it for a few years, and then brought a second one and converted the first one into a rental property, when you go to revalue that first property, it's going to be way easier because you've already lived in it for a few years. Now, what are the advantages of buying a second property and turning your first one into a rental property instead of buying a completely separate buy-to-let? Now, obviously the first advantage is that you can take your time. You don't have to rush refurbishment within a few weeks to get a tenant in ASAP, and you don't have to rush a refurbishment and try and force every single little penny to get the revaluation you want. You can take your time, refurbish it as you go, save some money, get it revalued down the line, and it's a way more relaxed process. You can wait for the market to improve, you can pay down your mortgage, and you can just enjoy your new home. You don't have to rush because you've already converted the first property into the rental property. You don't have to buy a completely empty property, rush the refurbishment and get a tenant in as quick as possible. You can kind of just start looking for this second property, enjoy it, put in some offers, go through the legal process, exchange, completion, and while all that's going on, you can start looking for a tenant for the first property. And then when you're pretty close to completion, you can change the mortgage on your first property from a residential mortgage to a buy-to-let mortgage and accept your tenant. And you've got a pretty seamless change from it being your personal property to being a rental property with a tenant in it. So with a separate buy-to-let property, it might take you at least 6 weeks, to a few months to buy the property, refurb it and get a tenant in. Whereas obviously changing your first property to a buy-to-let property, you've almost got like a 0-day time lag between it being your personal property that you live in and being a rental property with a tenant. And therefore you don't have to worry about making mortgage payments on an empty property. You can pretty much get the tenant in the same day that you move out. Now, how's that for a void period? If you've made it this far into the video, then be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and check out some of my other videos. Another advantage is that you don't have to have all the money at once. As long as you've got the deposit, you can go out there and buy the second property and just kind of refurbish it whenever you have the money. Once you've finished the renovation and enjoyed living there for a while, you can start the process again and save up for a new deposit and then buy a third property and turn your second property into a rental property as well. Another advantage is that you can use a much smaller deposit as well. If you're buying a completely separate buy-to-let, you'll need like a 20-25% down payment on the mortgage. Whereas if you're buying a home to live in, you only need a 5 or a 10% deposit. And you can let the equity in your property build up over a few years. You can add value through the refurbishments, pay down the mortgage, wait for the property to increase in value through capital appreciation, and then when you're ready, convert it into a rental property and remortgage onto a 75% or an 80% buy-to-let mortgage. You can also take advantage of the rental room allowance, and when you convert your first property into that rental property, you can kind of convert it as like a pre-packaged buy-to-let. You can go out there while you've got your first property and find a lodger and take advantage of that £7,500 tax-free rental income. And then when you're starting to look for your second property and you want to convert your property into a buy-to-let, you've already got a tenant in there already. So you only need to find a few more tenants to put into that property when you go out and buy your second property. Now, there are some disadvantages as well. And the main disadvantage is that it kind of blends home life and investment all into one. You'll find yourself working at all hours of the weekdays and the weekends as well because you're living in the property and you'll just want to refurbish it as quickly as possible. That means you might not really be able to spend as much time with the family because you're too busy working, and that's never great. It also might be quite hard to balance with a family because you'll be moving to a new property every few years and therefore you'll never really have your forever home, which is kind of sad really. And you'll never really be viewing your home truly as a home. You'll be viewing it as an investment. And you won't buy the property based off feel and enjoyment and excitement, you'll buy it based off the numbers. So that's my thoughts on buying a home versus buying a completely separate buy-to-let. So which one do I think is better? And well, in my circumstance, I don't have a wife or kids yet, and I don't mind moving properties every few years. So therefore it's probably better for me to buy a second property and convert my old one into a buy-to-let, because then I don't have to save a giant deposit each time. I can kind of just go and do it at a leisurely pace as I see fit. But obviously that's not going to suit everyone. Say if you've got a wife and 3 kids, but you want to invest in 1-bed flats. It's just not going to work. Or maybe you want to keep home life and investment completely separate. You want to come home from your busy day at work and just relax. You don't want to have to come home to a bit of a tip and focus on refurbishing the property until ungodly hours of the night. And as always guys, if you enjoyed the video, then be sure to check out some of my others. Alternatively, subscribe to the channel and ding the notification bell, because that way you'll be alerted when I upload a new video. Cheers.